Respiration. Respiration. Another way of describing this would be gas exchange. One of the questions on your assignment had to do with how does the mitochondrion get the things it needs to do what it has to do? Well, gas exchange is one of them, because almost every living thing uses oxygen as a way to metabolize some kind of sugar. Typically, C6H12O6 is our primary source of energy, right? And we need 6 oxygen molecules to combine with that in order to produce the CO2 and the water and what we call the ATP energy, right? The energy sort of gets transferred into the ATP. So guess what? We learned in digestion how to get this, but now we must figure out how we get this. The other part of that, the key ingredient, is the oxygen. There are some creatures that live in deep parts of the ocean near undersea volcanic vents that don't use oxygen at all. And there's a few other bacteria that live deep in the mud that don't use oxygen. So you don't have to have oxygen to live, but most of the living things on Earth, especially the ones that we're familiar with, do use oxygen. And so it's a very important thing. And if you don't need oxygen, you do need something else. So you still have to acquire something. So respiration is basically how do we acquire the gases we do need and get rid of the waste gas of carbon dioxide at the end that we're building that up and we don't need it. Okay? Water is the other part of that, but water, of course, it's not technically a waste because we can always use water. It's useful to us. So carbon dioxide has to be eliminated, though. Okay, so remember, if we talk about an individual cell, a single cell organism, how does it work? Well, the nice thing about a single cell is it's very small, and it has a membrane, and oxygen can diffuse into the cell through the membrane without any trouble. And then once it's through the cell, it can move around and diffuse throughout the entire cell. It can find the mitochondrion right there, where it can go inside, and the mitochondrion can use it along with glucose to make energy. And then the carbon dioxide that's being produced by the mitochondrion, all over the place inside the cell, can then diffuse back out again. And so, because it's a simple diffusion type thing, the cell doesn't need any particular mechanism to breathe. It just sits there, and the stuff moves in and out because of concentration gradients. If you're a cell, then you can imagine that inside the cell, carbon dioxide is constantly building up because you're doing the respiration thing in your mitochondria, right? So you're producing carbon dioxide and water. So typically there would be more carbon dioxide in the cell than outside of it, and it would naturally diffuse out, following the gradient. And then the oxygen levels would be lower inside the cell because you're using it up constantly in respiration. The mitochondrion is combining that oxygen, or using that oxygen, I should say, to break up glucose, so it's constantly getting used up. So the concentrations of oxygen would generally be greater outside. And so there's natural concentration gradients that occur and doesn't require any special mechanism. No lungs necessary, no tracheal tubes, no breathing, no nothing. Just sit there and absorb and let it go in and out. But as you get bigger, kind of like with digestion, we have the same problem. A larger organism with many cells means that the cells on the inside are quite a bit removed from the outside environment. So if you were a large multicellular organism, then relying on diffusion would mean that the O2 would have to diffuse into this cell. And it would be used by that cell, and there may not be much left. If that cell's using it up, its mitochondria, sucking that oxygen up and using it, then very little is going to get to this guy, and virtually none is going to make it into the middle. And so we have this problem where the outside cells can get oxygen directly, but the inside cells can't. So we need a way for the oxygen to be distributed through the body. We need a way, a system, to move the oxygen around that doesn't rely entirely on diffusion. And this is typically true for larger animals. But some can get away with it. Some animals can get away with diffusion only. For instance, the earthworm. If we draw an earthworm, there's an earthworm. Okay? Doesn't look like an earthworm, but if I put this little thing right here, and then I get a smaller line like this, and I just kind of go like this, oh my God, look at that, it's an earthworm. Or it could be a leech or something like that. A leech could also be a good example. In the worm does not have lungs. It doesn't have any openings or tubes through its body. It coats itself in a nice thick slime, right? That's why a lot of these little invertebrate organisms. All right, batteries are changed. Little invertebrates like leeches and worms and slugs and snails and things, they're always a little bit slimy, aren't they? And that's because when you're dry, it's harder for gas to move in and out. The diffusion of gas works better if there's a slimy, moist layer. And so these animals keep themselves moist primarily to enable oxygen to diffuse more easily into their tissues. And so they do rely on pretty much simple diffusion to get the oxygen that they need. Okay? And the oxygen enters into their outer tissues and it slowly diffuses through their tissues. The other thing you have to remember is that this method works really well if you're a worm and all you're going to do is, wiggle along very slowly. Think about the energy requirements of being a worm or a slug or a snail. Well, I wouldn't say none, but not much, right? They don't play hockey, right? A worm probably could never do something like that because it doesn't have an adequate system to ventilate the cells, the muscle cells needed and everything like that. So the activity level of these animals tends to be quite low. And so if you don't need as much energy, think about that equation, right? Think about this equation that powers living things. If you're not worried about getting a whole lot of energy, then you can make do with less CO, or less O2, right? You can make do with a little bit less. So the diffusion works, even though it's a slower process for something like a worm or a slug. As you get a little bit bigger, or more active, you need a system. So now think about insects. They're a little more active than worms. They crawl. Ants can lift 10 times their body weight. They're very busy. They move around. Some of them fly. And beating wings is an incredibly energy-intensive thing to do. So they need more energy. They can't rely on air to just diffuse into their bodies. Plus, they also have that hard exoskeleton. And insects typically are quite dry. So they're not going to rely on diffusion through the skin. They're going to have another system. So when we see insects, what insects have, so let's draw ourselves a typical insect, sort of some kind of, like a little wasp here, and then it would have this sort of strange little head, big bug eyes at the front, little antennas, right? Feet come out of this region here, and then this is the abdomen back here. So what happens in the insect is it has a whole bunch of tiny little tubules, little tubules, and I'm just going to check in your textbook to see how if they refer to them as trachea, little tubes. Just like we have a trachea. Our trachea is a great big tube in our throat, but they have little ones. And these tubes actually have openings right to the outside world. So what you'll see along the body, usually more so along the abdomen, are little holes, tiny holes. They would be, barely big enough to stick a pin into, but they're big enough to let oxygen molecules in. And these holes on the outside, they're called spiracles. Spiracles. And if you were to look sort of at a spiracle, it's attached to a tube that goes into the body. And the tubes go into the body, and they branch. And so there's a system of tubes that come out of these called the trachea. Tracheae. Tracheae in Latin means more than one trachea. And these tubes extend, and they also would be here and in the head. And so basically, an insect has a whole system of tubes, and they just go to holes, and the air can move in and out. So in the cells, the oxygen is going into the spiracles and in through the tubes to all the tissues, which then use it. And then the CO2, which is being made by the tissues, right, inside, is going into those same tubes and coming out of the spiracles. Gas exchange. They don't have to push or pull. There's no lungs causing the air to move. The air moves passively by diffusion through the tubules. Now, it's true that there will be some muscle contractions and things inside that will sort of possibly push and pull on the tubes and might contribute to the movement of air. So just like, you know, how our leg muscles can actually help the blood return through our veins by contraction and squeezing the veins. So it's not necessarily designed for that, but muscle action might increase a little bit the way the air flows. But nonetheless, it's pretty much a diffusion system. So similar to the worm, but different. And what we notice about evolution, and we'll learn this later in our evolution unit, remember I said evolution is not a progression towards the best organism. It's basically just a whole bunch of possibilities. And each possibility might work really well in one spot and work really badly in another. So if you live under the ocean or in a lake or in the mud, the system of diffusion for invertebrates works really well. But if you want to be more living like an insect in those environments, this is a better system. And you can see how we're kind of creeping towards the system that mammals and humans have. All right. Let's look at another option. In this option, we will draw some kind of fish. Doesn't look like a fish? It looks like a fish. It could be not necessarily a fish. It might be what they call it looks like a little bit like a shark, but the fin on top is wrong. It could be a prehistoric fish. Looks like one of those, what do they call them? I forget the name of them now. Coelacanth. Anyway, some kind of undersea creature. It doesn't have to be a fish. There's lots of things that live in the ocean that aren't fish, like lobsters and crayfish and in the water, right? Jellyfish and all kinds of things. These guys have a different system. What they have is a gill system. So they usually have these slits, which are like flaps that open and close, right? And if we look at the gills inside, what we would find inside one of those flaps, so let's take the flap, kind of like this, and we'll just kind of look inside of it. So there's the flap. So the actual gill slit is really just the edge of the flap over here. That's what we've drawn right there. But the flap can move in and out of the board. And if we look inside of that, what we will see is that inside of this, there's our blood vessels that come in and form capillary networks. Inside the gill, there's actually a very filamentous sort of fibrous type tissue. If you look at, many of you have caught a fish and you look in the gills, you pull them open, and what there is it's almost like there's like bones that go like this, and then coming off the bones are all these little sort of fibrous things like this. And of course, why do you think this is the case? See if you can think about digestion. If you're trying to get stuff in and out of your body, where does that happen in digestion? Where does it get into you? No, that's the donut hole. Where does it actually become part of your body? It gets into your bloodstream through the intestines, which are wrapped with capillaries. But in order to make that more efficient, what did we find? What structures are on the intestine that increase the surface area? Yeah? The villi. So if you just had a flat membrane here, it wouldn't have as much surface area. But if you have tiny little hairs, then you have way more surface area, right? If you calculate the area all around a hair, it's more than just a flat part. So these little hairy sort of filamentous structures increase the surface area of the gill thousands of times, which allow for much more surface for the gases to move in and out, so it makes it more efficient. And of course, there are capillaries in here, and the capillaries are basically allowing the blood, which the oxygen then would diffuse directly into the cells in these little filaments, right? And then into the capillaries that are surrounding it, and then into the bloodstream of the fish. Now the fish, of course, has an additional sort of thing. Unlike the insect that relied on just the passive movement of air, or the worm, the fish has sort of coupled the distribution of oxygen with its circulatory system. And that's a different thing. We haven't seen that yet. That's where you borrow the movement of blood to move the oxygen around the body. Because obviously, if it goes into the gills, how does it get to the tail, right? It's too far to diffuse. So now we see the development of a link between the respiratory system of air exchange and using the circulatory system as a nice way to shuttle the oxygen around the body and the CO2 back for the exchange. So we centralize our exchange in one spot. If you go back to the worm, the exchange is happening all over. It's happening in and out. CO2, oxygen in, CO2 out, all over the worm. Even in the insect, it's happening pretty much all over wherever the spiracles are. Whereas in this particular animal, the gas exchange is only happening where the gills are, and then we need a transport system to move it around. So the circulatory system takes over. And the circulatory system contains a molecule that is able to grab and hold on to oxygen and carbon dioxide. Not every animal uses the same molecule. Humans and animals use hemoglobin, but some animals use different molecules, but they all serve the same purpose. So gills are sort of another adaptation. Gills work really well in water because water has just the right concentrations of oxygen gas in it. Right? Just like the air has oxygen, water has oxygen in it too. The gases are dissolved in the water. But gills are specially designed to pull the oxygen out of the water. Water tends to have less oxygen concentrations than air. That's why humans can't breathe underwater. But humans can breathe liquid if we wanted to. It's possible to get a liquid that can dissolve more oxygen than water can. And you can breathe it into your lungs and out again, and that liquid will do the same job as air. The whole trick is water doesn't hold oxygen as much as we need it to. So our lungs are not designed for that. They've evolved for land living, and it's a different system. But gills evolved for water living, and it's possibly because of all these tiny little hairs, right, or hair-like structures on the gill, that they're actually able to withdraw enough oxygen from the water. And lots of animals that live underwater have gills. Interestingly enough, some animals have a little bit of both. And if you think about it, if you look, it's fun to think about how things evolved. Inside of a fish, there is a little organ. It's called a swim bladder. And it's basically a little bladder filled with air. And what the fish uses it for is not breathing. What the fish uses it for is to control its buoyancy. So if the fish wants to sink, it takes air out of the swim bladder, and it causes the fish to become less buoyant and it sinks. Or it can move air into the swim bladder from its blood and cause the fish to become more buoyant. And so the swim bladder is basically a little bubble of air inside the fish in a membrane-bound organ that allowed it to move air essentially in and out of its bloodstream to adjust its density or its overall buoyancy in the water. If you've ever tried to swim very deep, you know that humans, the problem is we keep floating back up, right? And you have to kind of fight to go deep, which is weird. Humans, if this is the surface of the water and you jump in the water, humans tend to kind of sort of float right about there. Actually, we'd be more sideways. We kind of float just under the water. It's almost like, it's almost like fate is saying, ha ha ha, you can't swim above the water to breathe, but you're only going to sink maybe a foot down and it's going to be just enough for you to drown, right? It's kind of weird. We actually float like that. And depending on your body, you might float even higher on the surface. And there are some people who have enough distribution of fat through their body where they can float without even trying, whereas most of us have to work a little bit. But in order to move up and down in the water, you need to adjust. So you can imagine if some fish had a swim bladder, that it's possible that some of the air inside that swim bladder might be able to diffuse in and out of the blood. And it might give the fish an advantage. And over millions of years, right? Over millions of years, the swim bladder could potentially evolve into something like a lung. And there are fish that have a swim bladder that actually can function sort of like a lung. You ever seen a mud skipper? It's a fish that can jump out of the water and hop along the mud. And the reason it can do this is because it's evolved to use its primitive lung to give it enough air to get from one little pool of water to the next, because it lives in places where it frequently dries up. So that there's a lake in Africa, but the sun beats down, the floodplain maybe, and the floodplain begins to dry up, and now it's just little pools of water all over, and this little fish can jump out of one pool, hop across the mud, and go into the other. It's called a mud skipper. You can Google it. It's quite cool. Then we see situations like the frog, which does have a good developed lung. It's a vertebrate now, has a backbone. It's more closely related to us. It has a backbone. It has a lung, but the frog does two different things. So let's draw ourselves a frog here. Right, Mr. Frog. Mr. Frog has a lung inside, and the lung works very much like ours does. But he also, remember how frogs are a little bit slimy? He can also absorb some oxygen through his skin, right? And underneath, in the mouth of the frog, inside his mouth, there are linings in his mouth that contain tons of capillaries. And he can actually absorb oxygen right through his mouth into his bloodstream without actually breathing it down to his lung. So the frog has a double system where it does have a lung, but the lung is not enough. And it can absorb oxygen through its skin to sort of help out. So you can see how, with evolution, you can see how there's examples of changes, right? Examples of organisms that go from having no systems, like the worm, to tracheal systems, and then we see gills and circulatory systems working together. And in the frog, we see, he's still relying on some diffusion, but he's also got a lung that helps out, and so on. We can see all these intermediary steps until we get to vertebrates like us, right? Mammals. So in the mammalian system, we basically have a mouth. Here's our mouth. Here's Mr. Weird Guy, right? With a pronounced chin, apparently. And we have a tube, but we have the mouth here. Remember the pharynx? And it goes down here in front. The esophagus from our digestive system also sort of connects here, but it goes in behind, and it goes off to the stomach for digestion. And remember we said there's a little flap here that can block the trachea, the windpipe. So what happens is the trachea goes down like this. The trachea, that's the tube. The trachea is a tube, and it has cartilage ridges in it, like this. And these cartilage ridges keep the tube from collapsing. So air is very important. You can't have a flexible, soft tube that keeps going boop, and it's got to be rigid enough to stay open. And so the trachea is the first part after the mouth, and the pharynx opens into the pharynx, throat. The trachea has, right about here, a specialized structure. Maybe I can just draw it up here. It's a bony sort of structure, and inside of it, it's covered with tiny muscles that can cause it to change its shape and move. And inside of this trachea, there is sort of, if you were looking down your throat, so this circle represents looking down your throat, there's tissue that forms folds like this. And these folds can open and close and vibrate and buzz, and of course they make our voice. So we've utilized the airway. We've utilized the airway of our respiratory system to do another job, to allow us to communicate. We don't really need to talk in order to breathe, but if we have this system set up with air moving in and out, then why not use it also to help us speak? So the trachea has the larynx. That's what this structure is called. Larynx, or voice box, or Adam's apple, right? Those all mean the same thing. Then what happens is, if we go further into the chest, the trachea, I'll just draw the trachea like this, it branches into two main branches. The two main branches are called the bronchi. The bronchi, there's two of them. If it was singular in Latin, you got to remember, with Latin, it's not like English where we put an S on things to make plural, like a car and cars, a dog and dogs. To make plural, they use different letters. So one of these tubes is called a bronchus. And then the way you make a plural is you change an us to an I, bronchi. That means more than one. Right? So one of the things about biology is you also have to learn a little bit of Latin, because it's used so often for the language of science, right? Describing things. So if we're talking about both branches, both of these branches would be the bronchi. So let me draw a little arrow here. Bronchi. And then the branches themselves branch off into smaller and smaller branches. Okay? And eventually they form tiny, tiny branches. I can only get so small with this. But these tiny branches keep on branching and down into the lung. That's what the lung is. It's basically just a big mesh of branch tubules like this. And they get smaller and smaller and smaller. So we call these bronchioles. Remember, arterioles are small arteries? Bronchioles are small bronchi. The bronchioles, right, are the smaller versions of this. And eventually, just like on a tree, the thick tree trunk, then you have thick branches, and they branch into smaller branches and smaller branches. Eventually you get so small that if we were to look at the end of one of these little branches and blow it up with our biological blow-up trick here, what we would see is the tiny, tiny, tiny bronchiole has sacs on it. And it almost looks like, under the microscope, it almost looks like a bunch of grapes hanging on a vine. And these sacs are the end, the tube ends like that, with these little sacs on the end. The sacs are called alveoli. I better write that where I have room. Again, one of them is called an alveolus, but alveoli. The alveoli are these little sacs at the end of the bronchioles. Of course, the alveoli are very small. Tiny, tiny, tiny structures, right? And if we were to take an alveoli and look at it in more detail, what we would notice is that the alveoli, right, at the bottom of the bronchiole, has, guess what? An entire network of capillaries all around it. Capillaries, which are connected to the bloodstream and go off from the lung back out into the body towards the heart, right? And of course, there would be some blue capillary network, right? So the veins would be, in this case, remember the veins are coming from the heart, so they're bringing blood to the lungs, and the arteries then, the arteries are coming from the heart. So the arteries are bringing the blood to the lungs this way, and the veins are taking it away this way back to the heart to pump to the rest of the body. And of course, these tiny capillaries allow for oxygen, which is flowing, breathing into the tubes and filling up the tubes, to diffuse into the bloodstream through the capillaries. So once again, we see the capillary network as the place where stuff gets into the blood here in the lungs. In this case, is oxygen. And don't forget that CO2 then is coming out because the CO2 that's in the blood from all the cells has built up, and it's coming back to the lungs, and it's going to diffuse out. Think about the concentration gradients. The air in the alveoli will have more oxygen than in the bloodstream because you've just breathed in fresh air. The bloodstream in the veins, well, in this case in the arteries, coming in, have been to the body and given away all their oxygen and have picked up all that CO2, right? So when they come back, they are full of CO2. So the concentration gradient would cause CO2 to leave the blood and go into the alveoli, and it would cause oxygen to leave the alveoli and go into the blood. So we are still using that same passive diffusion mechanism that the worm used and even the single cell used, right? It's all based on the same process, or the same fundamental thing of diffusing across these concentration gradients. But we've just developed a much more complicated system around that simple diffusion process because we're bigger and we need to move it more effectively, move the oxygen around. So we still rely on diffusion at this level, just like the single-celled organism in the alveoli of the lungs. Now, what's interesting about the human lung and the human breathing system is, are you guys not done? What's interesting is if you look at the human, let me just draw a quick head again. This person has a severe goiter of some kind. Let's do that again. Mouth, chin, okay, head. All right. And if we look at the airway going down here, branching off into the lungs, right? And then we have the lungs down here, all branches. Think about it. The oxygen goes in, right? So inside this tube, let me blow up the tube from our mouth. So our mouth, all the way down to where the bronchi start to branch. If we look inside that tube, we have oxygen that's coming in, right? But when we breathe out, we don't empty that tube completely. In other words, this part of the respiratory system is shared by the in and out. So every time we breathe, so think about breathing out. When you breathe out, there's still stale air with not much oxygen left in your trachea. And then when you breathe in, you're breathing that back into your lungs. So there's kind of like this area where it's kind of like, it would be better if we had air coming in one way, going through the lungs and going out another way so that there's no overlap. So you're not backwashing into the system every time you breathe, because you kind of are. You're backwashing stale air that's trapped in the trachea back into your lungs. It's not a perfect system. It's a system that evolved that works. What's interesting is birds have a slightly more efficient system. Birds have found a way to minimize this stale backwash. The other problem is we're only breathing in half the time. So our lungs are only getting oxygen half the time when we breathe in, but during exhale, now there's nothing in there, it's empty. So the exhaling represents time when we're not utilizing it, or our lungs are not getting any oxygen. That seems inefficient. What if there was a way to get oxygen at the same time as you exhale? And there is. Birds have figured it out. Birds, to fly, they need tons of energy. Flying's hard. Have you ever tried to fly? You flap your arms really hard? You know, yeah. I bet you have tried, yeah. But you can't fly. You don't have the structures to do it. But even if you did, you wouldn't be able to fly. The muscles of a bird on the chest, so the muscles that do this are essentially your pectoralis muscles, chest muscles. We have puny little chest muscles. If you look at a bird, almost the entire bird is chest muscle. In fact, when you eat a chicken breast, that's what you're eating. Chicken pectoralis, with a little bit of what's called the supracoracoideus underneath. The flight muscles. That's the bulk of the bird, because flying is so energy demanding, right? So what happens with the bird, it's kind of hard to draw, but the bird has a trachea, and it has the two lungs, right? I'll draw the lungs like this. But it also has, around the lungs, air sacs, special air sacs. And so the way it works is when the bird breathes in, the air travels, first, I didn't really draw this very well, but travels through the air sac, right? First, then through the lungs, then through the other air sacs, and then back out again. So what happens is on the inhale, the bird inhales, it fills the air sacs, right? And the lung. Then when it's exhaling, it's going to breathe out now. The air that's been stored over here goes out, but the air that's in these air sacs travels through the lungs during exhale. And then it goes over to the other side. So that picture is really crazy, but you get the idea. You have an air sac, a lung, and an air sac. So you inhale, you fill the air sac, which pushes the air that was in the air sac into the lung, which pushes the air that was in the lung into the other air sac, which pushes the air that was in that air sac out. So you're exhaling when you're breathing out to expel this air from this air sac. It's drawing air from the other air sacs across the lungs. So birds are actually still breathing in when they breathe out, in a sense. They found a way to keep air moving through the lungs constantly, rather than just like us, inhale and then pause and then exhale and then wait for the next inhale, which gives birds a much more efficient respiratory system. Pretty cool. It's amazing all the different ways that evolution has sort of figured out to breathe. And it all depends on where you live and what you do and what environment you're in, right? So that's pretty cool. We could talk a little bit about, just to wrap up, a few problems and diseases and things that happen to lungs, because a lot of us are going into medical professions at some point. So lung damage occurs when the alveoli become plugged or filled with fluid, or physically damage themselves. I guess what I should say is not necessarily lung damage. We should change that word to, let's go back here. Let's change this word to lung problems. Some of these problems are reversible and fixable, and some of them are not, right? So we should kind of maintain how that works. Oh, the other thing I should mention, I just realized this, is the breathing apparatus. How do we control the lungs? So, you know what? Let me just pause for a minute, and we'll come back to this later. Let me just go back here and explain, how do you actually get your lungs to work? Because that's kind of important. So underneath your lungs, okay, there is a muscular sheet like this. It's called the diaphragm. P-H-R-A-G-M, the diaphragm. And what the diaphragm does is it basically separates your chest cavity from your abdomen. I showed it to you on that guy back there, remember? So it's kind of like a sheet of muscle that goes right all through here, and it separates the two. But the sheet of muscle, because it's muscle, what it can do is it can push downwards and push upwards. So the diaphragm can push up and down like this. And so when it pulls down, right? When the diaphragm pulls down, lungs again, if the diaphragm pulls downwards, I'll exaggerate here, inside the chest cavity, it creates a larger space. It increases the volume of the chest cavity. Well, I don't know if you know anything about physics, but if you increase the volume of something, you create kind of like a vacuum effect, right? The pressure inside the lungs will be less because the air that's in there is now spread over a larger volume. And so what that does is it causes air pressure from the outside to literally push air into the lungs and fill them up. So when we breathe, we don't actually suck air in. What we do is we create a vacuum with our muscular diaphragm. We create a lower pressure inside by expanding the volume of our chest. And if you do that with your mouth closed and your nose closed, nothing happens. But with your mouth open, that lower pressure instantly causes the air outside to rush into the lungs. Now, if you were in a room where we could control the air pressure, we could suck the air out slowly. There would be a point where the air pressure in the room would be less than the pressure or than the vacuum you can create in your lungs. And even if you were breathing like crazy, you wouldn't be able to suck any air in. Because it's not you sucking air in. It's air being pushed in by the air pressure outside, pushed into the place where you've sort of made a vacuum by expanding the volume, right? That's the same way you drink from a straw. It's the same idea. When you drink from a straw, you don't suck the fluid up the straw. What you do is you create a vacuum inside the straw by drawing the air out. And then it's the pressure of the air outside that pushes on the liquid, which makes the liquid under pressure, which pushes the liquid up the straw. So really, what makes you drink from a straw is outside air pressure. And all you're doing with your mouth is creating a vacuum inside that allows the outside air pressure to push the liquid up the straw. Same thing with your lungs. You create a vacuum, and the outside air pushes air into the lungs and expands. If you relax the diaphragm, just let it relax, it goes back to its normal position, and the air then just exhales gently out of the lungs. But of course, you can also contract it. It's a muscle, so you can contract it up very hard, and you can push air forcefully back out. And of course, we've learned that by using the diaphragm in a very controlled way, it's a very skilled muscle, we can force air in and out of our lungs at various rates to allow us to speak, or to sing, or to yell, or to whisper, and we can vary how much air is moving in and out. So the diaphragm, of course, is a very important muscle that enables breathing to actually work. Okay? So that's what I forgot to leave out. So now let's go back to lung problems. And what happens to your lungs? Well, we'll go down below here. The most common lung problems are temporary problems. When bacteria or foreign materials enter the lungs, your body's response is to somehow try to eliminate them. And the way you eliminate them is either, well, it's a number of things, but what your body will do is it will send white blood cells. Remember the white blood cells, the leukocytes, which fight infections? It'll send them to the area. There's an invader in here. All these white blood cells coming into the area, right, through the bloodstream, are creating pus as they fight and die. The blood is also pumping more fluid in there to get the blood components to the spot. So what tends to happen is you get a buildup of fluid and mucus in the lungs. So buildup of fluid and mucus is typically one of the problems that we have with our lungs most commonly. This could be the result of an infection by a bacteria. can also be the result of an infection or particulates in the air that we breathe. Dust, soot. One of the worst ones is asbestos. Asbestos fibers that are very tiny and small enough to get in your lungs and lodge in there. And they create all kinds of buildup of fluid and infection. The buildup of fluid is often called pneumonia. Pneumonia. Not to be confused with ammonia, which has nothing to do with breathing. Ammonia is a chemical. It's a base chemical. It's NH3. Very important biological chemical, but ammonia has nothing to do with breathing. The pneumo means lungs. Pneumo also refers to air, like a pneumatic drill is a word for like a jackhammer. So pneumonia, fluid buildup in the lungs. Typically, you get a cold, your body fights it off pretty quickly within a few days, up to a week or so. Sometimes that cold, your body has a hard time fighting it, and the cold moves further down. The infection and the mucus moves further down your trachea into your lungs, and it can start to build up fluid, and sometimes pneumonia is a consequence of a really bad cold. If you get pneumonia, though, what has to happen is you need to go to a doctor who's going to, first of all, give you some kind of antibiotic to clear the bacterial infection that's causing it. And then, of course, in worst case scenario, you might have to put you on tubes and carefully try to try to get you help you to breathe and get the fluid out of your lungs as much as possible. One of the things that causes buildup of the fluid in the lungs is inactivity of the lungs. And there's two ways of breathing. This is an interesting thing to think about. When you breathe, typically, if you watch someone who breathes, it's their shoulders kind of going up and down, which means they're using only the top portion of their lungs. They're filling the top half of their lungs with air and letting it out, and that's enough. And that's usually what we do when we're relaxed and we don't need a lot of air. It's just a very light, shallow breathing. But if you watch somebody who's running a marathon, or if you watch a singer who's singing, because singing requires a lot of lung power, what they do is they breathe using the rib cage more. They go like this, and they suck out at the bottom. The rib cage expands, right? This is called belly breathing. So you can see their stomach moving down here, right? And that's causing the bottom of the lungs to expand more, which fills the lungs more completely with air. Old people often suffer from inactivity, either because they can't move around because they have arthritis or other conditions, or they just tend to not move as much and they're sitting around a lot. So they do a lot of shallow breathing. What that means is sometimes in the bottom of their lungs, fluid will build up. So it's much easier for someone who's older to get a pneumonia or an infection or have fluid build up in the lungs. So they have to be extremely careful about that. And when they go into a hospital for something, you're laying in a hospital bed for 2 weeks, guess what? Your lungs can fill up. So older folks often have pneumonia as a complication of some other illness that's causing them to be laid up because they're not breathing. And so, of course, what do? We practice exercise, of course, get your lungs breathing as full as much as possible, and meditative breathing where you breathe deep breaths in and out and all those things. Those are all healthy and good to keep your lungs clear of fluid. What's supposed to happen is inside the lungs, there are tiny little cilia that line the bronchioles, and the little cilia beat, right? And they wiggle and they push all the mucus and stuff up. And so when you have a cold, all these little cilia are moving the infections and the mucus up your lungs, gets into your throat, and of course, and you're like, you got this big hork that you bring up, right? You cough all that phlegm, we call it, up, and then either you swallow it, where the stomach acid kills everything, or you spit it out or whatever. But that system, of course, can be overwhelmed, and it's overwhelmed when you have pneumonia. You just can't get the fluid out. So pneumonia can be caused by many different things. There's some other lung diseases, though, that happen. There's a disease called emphysema. Emphysema. Smokers sometimes suffer from this. And emphysema is a situation where you have a very difficult time breathing out. It's damage to the actual alveoli themselves and the bronchi. Just looking it up here to make sure I don't tell you the wrong thing. It's a loss of elasticity. That's how your textbook describes it. A loss of elasticity in the lungs. The lungs have to be stretchy, right? To expand and contract. And if they lose this elastic effect, then you can force air in with your diaphragm and get a deep breath. But then you have to really force to get it out because the lungs aren't sort of snapping back the way they normally should. And what we know is that emphysema is quite a common effect of heavy smoking over a lifetime. You can have this issue. Smoking does a whole bunch of things to your lungs because your lungs were not designed to inhale dirty air. In fact, our nose and our mouth, where we breathe from, have little hairs in them. And the hairs of our nose, especially, our nose is technically where we're supposed to breathe from. We breathe through our mouth sometimes if we need extra air, if we're exercising or whatever, but the air goes into your nose. All those little hairs are designed to trap dirt and soot and things so they don't get into your lungs. And all down your throat, the cilia of the trachea will trap, and the mucus will come out and get rid of all that stuff that's trying to get in there. But of course, cigarette smoke, when you're breathing that, and you're purposely sucking it deep into your lungs, right? When you smoke a cigarette, I think originally when smoking developed, it was all about taste, the taste of smoke and tobacco. And, people who used to smoke pipes back in the day, like I'm talking 1,000 years ago when they started smoking, they probably didn't suck the smoke right into their lungs. What's happened over the years is they would take it into their mouth, taste the smoke, and blow it out. But then what they discovered is the nicotine drug that's in the tobacco, it seeps through your mouth tissues a little bit into your blood, and it can give you this sort of mildly buzzy feeling. And then they slowly learned that they could increase the buzzy feeling if they were to sort of breathe the smoke deeper into their lungs. And so this habit of inhaling the smoke where they go and they suck it all in and then they breathe it out, that is really what's responsible for causing all of the lung problems. Now, tobacco can also cause mouth problems, so it's not really a great thing to be doing all the time at all anyway. Remember, everything in moderation. But you don't want to be drawing dirty smoke into your lungs. When you're sitting at a campfire, when the smoke comes to you, you don't open your lungs and suck in deep. You run away and try not to breathe, and it burns your eyes, and it's bad. And yet, those same people will then step away from the fire, light up a cigarette, and suck the smoke into their lungs. I remember watching a movie called Backdraft, which is all about firefighters. And it was funny. I think they did this on purpose to show the irony. All the firefighters would go to the fire, and they'd put on these big, massive Scott air packs, right, to protect them from breathing the smoke. And they'd go and they'd fight the fire and rescue people. And then when it was all done, they'd all come out, they'd rip off their air packs. Now they're all tired. And they're all standing around the trucks, and they'd light up cigarettes and start smoking. And they're sucking smoke into their lungs. They just spent 2 hours trying not to breathe smoke, and then they breathe the smoke of the cigarette. So the inhaling of cigarette smoke is primarily the reason for lung issues, right? But the carcinogenic effects of cigarette smoke can also affect the tissues of the mouth. And you can get mouth cancer and throat cancer and tongue cancer and cancer of the larynx and other things. So smoking, like anything, is not something you want to do on a regular basis. You want to not smoke very much, if at all. Oops, okay. So that's another condition of the lungs. Let's see. Oh, cystic fibrosis is another situation that you sometimes hear of. It's not as common, thankfully. But some people do suffer from this. It's a genetic disease. You don't catch this from germs. You're just basically, unlucky enough to get a set of genes that doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And essentially, in cystic fibrosis, what happens is the cells of the lungs are releasing too much mucus. Then the lungs easily become very clogged very quickly. And it's very difficult for people like this. Too much mucus. It says mucus. Mucus, M-U-C-U-S. And it's very difficult for these people to breathe because there's too much mucus in the lungs. So it's almost like the genes have gone overboard in terms of producing the mucus that we do need a little bit of, and they produce too much. And we get all these issues. Another disease that we commonly get is bronchitis. The word itis in medical terms usually refers to some kind of inflammation. So appendicitis is an inflamed and swollen appendix. Bronchitis is inflamed and swollen bronchi and bronchioles, the tubes that lead down to your lungs. And so bronchitis means that there is an inflammation in these tubes, and that is typically what we experience, coughing and mucus production. It often accompanies a bad cold, right? Because we're trying to get rid of an infection. There's such a thing as what they call chronic bronchitis. In medical terms, acute means it happens once because of some specific reason. So you catch a cold and you get acute bronchitis. The word chronic means it happens all the time, and it's sort of become more of like a condition. Chronic bronchitis happens to people who have damage to their bronchioles. All the little cilia inside become damaged, and the bronchi can't move the mucus properly. And that damage, again, can come from breathing in pollutants and things and poor quality air for a long period of time. Over time, it produces severe bronchitis that you get all the time. That's called chronic bronchitis. Or it flares up, every couple of days. And this is more common for people who worked in, like a coal mine or even in the steel plant back in the day when pollution control was less. It was more common. It's getting a little better, but there's still a fair bit of pollution. In fact, Sault Ste. Marie, because we're a steel town, we have more pollution in our air than other towns. And if you look at the instances of lung diseases in the Sioux, they are higher than they would be in another town that doesn't have a steel plant pumping out lots of pollutants into the air. So again, bronchitis. Asthma. Asthma is another situation that is related to the bronchioles and the bronchi being producing mucus and becoming inflamed. But asthma is usually more of an allergic response where our body responds too vigorously to something that normally wouldn't be much of a threat. That's how allergies work. And so you get a little bit of dust or pollen in your lungs, and rather than a simple mucus production and some cilia action and a little cough and you clear it out, these people, the lungs become severely irritated. The immune system goes into overdrive, right? It's like taking out a nuclear warhead because you have a sniper in the field. And it's like overkill. And so what happens is the bronchi become very inflamed, and they actually swell. And when they swell, they shrink in the middle, right? They swell, they get like this, they start to shrink. And the shrinking bronchi mean, of course, that your air can be cut off. And in severe asthma, they can shrink so small, they can swell so much that you can't get air into your lungs, and you can literally suffocate from severe asthma. Luckily, though, we found that there are certain drugs that you can put into an inhaler, breathe it into your lungs, and it quickly opens the bronchi and reduces the inflammation very quickly. So people who have asthma carry their inhaler or puffer, and they can use it to clear their lungs if they ever suffer from an attack where they're getting too much of that. So those are some of the things that can happen to your lungs. And of course, there's also the old lung cancer. And cancer of the lung, I guess we'll call it lung cancer. Lung cancer is a very difficult cancer to treat and deal with. One of the problems is it's hard to isolate it. It's hard to find it. The lungs are, we have really good scans now. Like we can do CAT scans and we can do really good imaging, and we can find cancer growing when it's much smaller, which helps. But treating lung cancer is difficult. So basically a cancer is a cell. Now remember, every cell has a job, right? So if you're a lung cell, your job is to change gases. In cancer, in all cancers, what typically happens is the regulatory genes that control the growing of the cell and reproduction of the cell are affected. And the cell begins to grow like crazy. It divides like nuts. And it makes new cells very quickly. But it also usually causes them to lose their job. They become a useless cell that doesn't do anything. And it's basically just a giant mass of useless cells, which we call a tumor. Right? And the tumor, of course, grows in there, and it doesn't actually do anything bad to you until it gets large enough that it begins to interfere with the functions of organs and things like that. So the tumor itself isn't toxic or anything like that, but it's a whole bunch of your cells that are growing like crazy and doing nothing. So imagine in society what would happen if a whole bunch of people started doing nothing and just kind of lazed around all day and expected the rest of us to pick up the slack. Eventually, the system would break. And so the treatment of lung cancer involves trying to isolate the tumors using different body scans, and then, if possible, surgery to remove the tumor, cut it out of the lung, or in extreme cases, remove the lung altogether. Sometimes they have to remove one of the lungs, and so a person has only one lung, where the other one is now gone. They can survive like this, but obviously their quality of life would be quite different, vastly different. One lung is going to mean breathing is that much more difficult. So lung cancers and they're difficult to treat because a lot of our drugs have a hard time, for some reason, dealing with lung tissue and lung tumors. The lungs are also a place where, because all of your blood, right, is flowing through your body, cancer cells from other parts of the body, right, if you have a spleen cancer or a liver cancer, they can get into the bloodstream or the lymph, and they can move through the body, and they end up lodged in the lungs. And so the lungs are often a place where we see a secondary site of a cancer. It attacks a certain organ, but then spreads. The little tumors break, little cells break off and travel through the blood, little cancerous, growing madly tumors, and they land in the lungs, because in the lungs you've got the alveoli, very tiny, tiny passages, easy for things to get caught in there. And these cells get caught in the lungs, and then they end up growing into a new tumor. So sometimes we see lung cancer as a secondary cancer to others. The best way to protect yourself, of course, is to keep your lungs clean. And the best way to keep your lungs clean is to avoid pollution as much as possible. This is harder to do when you live in a big city. I don't know if you've been watching with the COVID back when we had the lockdowns. They were showing pictures of cities that were once riddled with pollution and how clear the air had gotten because people weren't out driving and moving about, right? Air pollution in some cities is disastrous, especially if you go into like big cities in the Far East where you have, or India. But if you go to California, it's the same. Like the smog and the pollution is really, really bad. So we might have a steel plant, but maybe we still have better air than some of these big giant cities that are really, really polluted. And of course, the other big thing is this habit of smoking, in particular, inhaling smoke into your lungs. Your lungs aren't designed for that. They work very hard to keep themselves clean. And every time you suck that smoke in there, you are doing them a disservice. And over time, right? Over time, it can cause severe damages and cancers. It doesn't mean that if you take one puff of a cigarette one day that you should feel guilty for life. That's not going to affect you much. Your lungs can handle some smoke. They can handle it. It's not good. It's not a good idea, but they can handle it. Your body can heal. Your body can... When you go to a campfire and you get a big mouthful of smoke, you're not going to die early because of it. You're not going to get lung cancer because of it. Your body can handle it. But the problem with smoking is it becomes a habitual habit as we get addicted to the nicotine, and we smoke regularly throughout the day. And our lungs are like, holy crap, man, I can clean a little smoke, but I can't clean all this. So that's when you start doing the damage, right? Excessive smoking. Of course, the ideal is not to smoke anything at all, right? That's the ideal. But smoking can be a problem. And of course, they got rid of smoking, and now we have vaping. Vaping is... It's too early to know if it's as dangerous as smoking. The experiment hasn't been done yet. But luckily for us, there are a whole bunch of teenagers who are willing to be the guinea pigs and take this on. So for us old people watching the show, it's like, ooh, let's find out if vaping is going to kill people. And we're watching all the young teens as they vape and vape and vape like crazy. And in about 10 years, we're going to find out. And we're going to say, oh, look, it does kill people, as they all die. So you guys, your age group, is the experiment on vaping. And so we thank you for that. That's good scientific research you're doing. And you know I'm being completely sarcastic, right? Vaping is obviously bad for you. Your lungs aren't designed for chemical intake. Your digestive system is. You'd be better off drinking your vape than smoking it. Probably not. I don't mean that's something you should do. But your lungs are not designed for chemical intake. We've learned to do it. Because of the structure of the lungs, there's a very quick lots of exposure to the bloodstream in the lungs. And so any drug we inhale goes into our bloodstream rapidly. And we like that for the buzz, but we don't realize that that's not what our lungs have been designed for, and we're essentially killing our lungs when we do it. One of the things that they found was that in vaping, there's a chemical in the vape that gets into the lungs and reacts with tissue or solidifies. I forget what the chemical is. I have to look it up. And it actually forms like a gel in your lungs. And this gel in your lungs is like having severe pneumonia. And if you've heard about people who have died, it's because of that severe thickening of tissue and mucus in the lungs caused by the chemicals that are in the vape. Vaping is cleaner than smoke. It's more controlled. It has less chemicals in it. And it doesn't have things like the tar and the stuff from cigarettes that are hard on your lungs. But nonetheless, your lungs are not designed for chemical intake. That's not their job. And so it's very likely down the road we are going to see more and more evidence that supports the fact that vaping is a bad idea. We just shouldn't be doing that, right? It's not what your lungs are made for. At any rate, that's enough for today. We'll stop there. The respiratory system.